Infectious diseases remain one of the most dangerous aspects of modern life. Even with the wonders of modern science, this year alone over 400,000 people have been killed by the new infectious disease called COVID-19. However, it's not the most deadly pandemic in human history. We're going to be looking at some of the most deadly diseases known to man and what their impacts have been.
All through the world's history, there have from time to time been those who have wondered whether all this pain and suffering due to the process of dying from incurable disease was really necessary.
Inoculation, a long word, simple thing, a safe thing, and a free thing.
Infection rates are phenomenal. They're approaching unbelievable, and in some countries approaching the rate where there's a big concern whether we're ever going to be able to do anything about HIV.
COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
Mark Harrison is a professor at the University of Oxford and an expert in the history of diseases. I asked him how long pandemics have been around and why they spread.
Infectious disease has always been within human societies, but pandemics are something that probably has only existed for, say, the last 2 millennia, most likely, because pandemics do really depend on large societies, obviously a certain amount of mobility. So where you have large-scale civilizations, where you have cities where people cluster together, also where you have advanced agriculture, that is also very important because 80% of the diseases that affect humans come from animals.
One of the most dreaded diseases known to man is called the plague or the Black Death. The bubonic plague is a bacterial infection carried by fleas on the backs of rats. Those who got the disease would have about 3 to 5 days of an incubation period where they wouldn't have any symptoms. Then, once they displayed symptoms, 80% of those people would go on to die. Cities were wiped out, populations were destroyed. In Florence alone, over 60% of the population died from the disease.
What began in the middle of the 14th century in Central Asia somewhere, probably what's now Kazakhstan, and then spread to Europe, parts of North Africa and other parts of Asia. That probably killed getting on for 50% of the population. That had a huge impact. You can imagine what that would be like today. In many countries within Europe, it really hastened the end of feudalism because there were fewer labourers left to work on the land. They could command higher prices. They could begin to move around to get better positions. And so societies became freer. Some of these labourers began to amass considerable wealth. They became important people in their own right. So you had essentially the conditions for the emergence of early capitalism and of, in some respects, of democratic society. So that was a really powerful transition.
In 1918, during the First World War, the Spanish flu hit the world. Eventually, it would go on to kill even more people than the Great War it preceded. On the 11th of March 1918, the first known case of the Spanish flu was found at a military base at Kansas. The disease would go on to spread all over the globe because of the World War. Despite its name, the Spanish flu actually has very little to do with Spain. During World War I, Spain was one of the only countries in Europe to remain neutral. Therefore, its press was free to report on the devastating impact of the disease on their country, and the name stuck. During World War I, over 17 million people tragically lost their lives. However, many more would go on to die from having the Spanish flu.
Even a disease like the Spanish flu, so-called 1918-19, which killed probably more in terms of the number of people around the world than any other pandemic, probably around 50 million globally. Because the population of the world then was a lot higher, that amounted on average only to about 2%. So you can see the difference, huge difference with the Black Death. So that didn't have the same dramatic impact. And also coming at the end of the war, even though huge numbers of people died, people already, in a sense, that they'd had a huge crisis to deal with. Many people died. And so the impact of the flu was in some sense kind of caught up with the impact of the war. And the epidemic or pandemic tended to be forgotten in most countries. It didn't have the same kind of social impact.
One of the most extraordinary stories about any disease in human history is the story about smallpox. Smallpox is thousands of years old. The first known cases were from rashes in mummies in ancient Egypt from 300 BC. The disease was found all over the globe, from Asia to Africa, from Australia to Europe, and it was feared. 3 out of 10 people who got the disease would go on to die. However, in 1796, something extraordinary happened. An English doctor found that milkmaids who were infected with a disease called cowpox would not display symptoms of the disease smallpox if they were exposed to the infection. In 1801, Jenner would publish on the origin of the vaccine inoculation, where he goes on to say that he hopes for the annihilation of the smallpox, the most dreadful scourge of the human species, must be the final result of this practice. 179 years later, on the 8th of May 1980, the World Health Assembly declared smallpox to be officially eradicated from the planet.
Smallpox was driven away from our globe.
To try to eradicate smallpox. They had the technology. Theoretically, it was possible to do it, but there was political will individually within countries and internationally to do it. And ironically, I think one of the reasons why there was such a strong will internationally was because of the Cold War. I think that would actually be, in some ways, kind of counterproductive. But I think the rivalry between the USSR and the USA meant that they were really prepared to do their best to help what was then termed the Third World, where they both wanted to gain influence. All those things came together with the technology to produce a really unique situation in human history. So it's, in the end, it really came down, I think, to political will. That was the really crucial thing.
Despite advances in modern medicine, pandemics still have the ability to cripple nations. As recently as the 1980s, HIV/AIDS killed up to 32 million people all around the world. Therefore, my final question is, will humans ever be able to end the pain of pandemics?
So the 19th century had a huge number of pandemic diseases. You also had the spread of many animal diseases like rinderpest, foot and mouth disease all over the world. And you had spread of lots of plant diseases too. So that was a kind of big cluster. It's like a sort of age of epidemics or pandemics, if you like. And I think what we've moved into now is something pretty similar. Again, because of global trade, large-scale migration, a very connected world in terms of aviation. A whole range of factors have provided the conditions for disease to spread. The likelihood of different pandemics, pandemics of different diseases emerging seems to be high. If it's a disease against which we don't already have a vaccine, for instance, then we're going to be in reactive mode again. So what we need is some kind of proper international sanitary system, a kind of way, an international agreement for dealing with this by the very early 20th century. After a lot of useless effort in international sanitary conferences, eventually they managed to evolve a system for dealing with this that wasn't too disruptive to global trade. But I think we're some way off of that now, unfortunately.